This is going to be a difficult time, and grief is difficult at any time of the year, let alone grieving during a pandemic. Everything is strange, nothing is normal. And as Bill said, if you are entering into your first Christmas, or maybe it might be your second holiday season. Maybe your loved one died soon before the holidays last year, and it could feel like your first holiday season. You are actually being very courageous and brave for being here, so that doesn't go unnoticed by me. So grief and the holidays, they don't mix very well, do they? It's kind of like oil and water. We've had this image imprinted on our psyche from a very young age that we gather with family and loved ones and friends. These are people who gave our life meaning and brought joy to the season. And so how could you possibly prepare for this upcoming holiday season, let alone to be joyous, or even thinking that there might not even be any pain? And I'm sure you wish the holidays don't even arrive. I wish you could bypass it, I'm sure. But good mental health is not about avoiding the challenges and the pain that makes us human, that's part of the human condition. It's about coming to terms with heartbreaks. It's about learning how to manage it. That's what makes us human. But yet, a grieving person might tell themselves something. They might tell themselves a story. This is going to be a horrible Christmas season. Or it's going to be exhausting to pretend that I'm happy. Well, how can I pretend that I'm happy? But if you're willing to consider another narrative, then I'd like to offer that to you. And that might be gratitude. Now, that doesn't come without pain, because I'm never ever going to say that this experience is without any kind of pain. There'll always be an element of pain. But if you were to consider balancing that with gratitude, it might very well be the door you need to get through this holiday season. So tonight we're going to talk about creating a space for your pain and balancing that with gratitude. Now that might seem really rather counterintuitive. Why would I want to invite pain or any more pain? But it's about acknowledging the pain and balancing that with gratitude. How are you going to manage the pain as you go forward? And as we know, as soon as the pumpkins are put away, the candy's all finished from Halloween, the Christmas carols and the hymns begin. And I will tell you right now that the anticipation of a significant day is far worse than the day itself. Because you miss them every day. It's just that the holidays, which mean gathering, and as Bill said, maybe that person won't be at your table physically this year, it kind of magnifies their absence. So tonight we're just going to talk about acknowledging our pain, how we're going to manage our pain, and how we're going to show gratitude for what we still have in our lives. So we're probably going to be together for about an hour and a half. I'm going to break somewhere in the middle. If you need at any point in time to get up, use the restrooms, which are just outside the back doors, both the ladies and the men. If you need to get out and get a breath of fresh air, stretch your legs, I won't be offended. Please do whatever you need to do to look after yourself. I'm more than willing to answer any questions tonight. And I'll ask you if there are any questions, but please interrupt me at any point in time. While this isn't a support group format, I think we are small enough in terms of a presentation where we can entertain questions. And if there's anything specific that does not meet your needs during this presentation, because it is a general presentation, come up and speak to me afterwards, okay? I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. So, Before we begin, I'd like you all to kind of get comfortable in your chairs, and we're going to do a check-in. And I don't mean I'm going to ask you who your loved one was. We're going to do an internal check-in, okay? So for a moment, I'd like you to either close your eyes or gaze at the floor or gaze at something. And I want you to just check in. How are you feeling internally? Is your heart racing? Are you breathing shallow? Are you nervous? What's your feelings? What feelings come to the surface? Are you nervous? Are you profoundly sad? Are you angry? Do you resent having to be here? That's okay. Just be aware of that. And keep checking in with yourself. Are you holding any tension? Are there any butterflies in your stomach or your shoulders tense? Relax as you take in a deep breath and release. And I'd like you to remember that as you go forward into the holiday season. Okay, that's your first coping strategy. Whenever you feel overwhelmed, you just stop and you ground yourself by doing deep breathing. So in for 4, hold, and out for 4. And it slows everything down. Okay? Did you know that you were not only grieving, but you're a bereaved person? You are grieving as a result of death. And bereavement refers to being separated because of death. And you're not only torn apart and you feel robbed, but you also have special needs as a bereaved person. Keep that in mind as we go forward. You have special needs. Not anybody else, you. Sadness and grief deplete us of our inner resources. Physically, we are exhausted. Mentally, we are distracted. And emotionally, we live on the edge, fearing a loss of composure when we are with friends and family. Anybody experience that at all? That's a kind of an adequate description of grief. That might be on a good day. But it's also extremely unpredictable, very disruptive, and can also be overwhelming. And that's because this thing called grief that we're trying to avoid and trying to distract ourselves from is trying to get your attention. It's trying to get your attention. Because when we have responses after a loved one has died, it's normal and it's natural. As a clinician, I'd be more concerned if you weren't showing any responses, any reactions. Then you're at risk for delayed grief or prolonged grief. So if you're acutely grieving and you're experiencing anything we're going to be talking about tonight, then rest assured that you're normal. It doesn't feel normal, but you are normal given what you're experienced. And you're experiencing this because it's anchored in love and attachment. You wouldn't feel this way if you weren't attached to your loved one. You didn't have a business relationship with them. Although your head knows that they've died, you have a heart relationship with them. So Eric Fromm says, to spare oneself from grief at all cost can be achieved only at the price of total detachment, which excludes the ability to experience happiness. You are here because you were privileged to have loved. And if you choose not to open your heart again, then you're also choosing not to experience joy and happiness. We wouldn't know sunshine, we wouldn't know daylight if we didn't know darkness. We wouldn't know joy if we didn't know what pain was. So maybe our responses after a loved one has died, natural, normal, but maybe it's our response to an unfinished story. We didn't get to finish the story according to our timetable. We had no say in it. Even if your loved one was elderly, you would have loved one more day, one more week, one more hour with them. It just wasn't according to our timetable. We hadn't written the end. John Bramblett, who lost his 2-year-old son in a horrific accident at the end of the driveway of their home, he says, "If only I could hold you one more time, if only once more on my lap you could climb, I'd feel the warmth of life now gone and the weight of your tiny body close to mine. I'd look in the depths of your sky blue eyes to your very soul, and in those depths our souls would join. I would hold you like that forever, content to never move again. I would choose to let the world pass by while we sat there in stillness for all time that is to come. The two of us together in the simple contentment of just being, sharing the elusive gift we know as life." He started journaling after his son died, and this is an excerpt from something he wrote soon after he died. He had just finished treatment for cancer, and he says in his book that the little 2-year-old wanted to come into the bedroom and he wanted to play with Daddy. And he said, "I was just too exhausted." And I said, "Daddy can't play." And so his wife said, "Well, let him play outside. I'll watch him from the kitchen window." And in one instant, the accident happened. So here John is talking about all the things he would have done. And especially with a child, a younger child, it's all those dreams, right? It's the future. Because the story wasn't finished yet. So what are we talking about when we're talking about grief? Well, discard the notion of stages, okay? We would love it to be nice and sequential and clean, because if B follows A and C follows B, then we're closer to the end, right? And we're done. But Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief weren't really meant to imply that it represented nice, clean, orderly, linear process, but it was adopted as such. So there are no stages. Instead, it's going to come upon you like waves or bursts, okay? When you least expect it. It might hit you, might slap you on the side of the face. And when you anticipate a painful moment, you might be able to get through it. But because it comes like waves, it does subside until the next one. And very early in the process, those waves, as if you're in the middle of a storm, standing on a beach, they come frequently, they come one on top of another, and they can kind of drag you under sometimes. But they also give you a reprieve. So instead of going against a wave, your job is to go with the wave and understand that it's normal. And the intensity in your pain is going to peak at significant days. It's going to get worse. It's going to feel like it's getting worse. perhaps weeks and months after a death. So if you discard the notion of stages and it kind of getting better with every single day, it actually isn't going to happen that way. It's much more rockier at the beginning of the process. Because once the shock and numbness have worn off, once the busyness of a funeral, a memorial service, once the busyness of visitors or phone calls, once they fade, you're left there with your grief, having to figure out what you're going to do. And it can feel worse. So if you're very early in the process, be prepared, but it's okay, it's normal. And be okay also with moments of positive feelings. Be okay with moments where you actually might laugh. You could force yourself to laugh. It may not be a belly laugh, but that's okay. That's when you're the other side of the wave. So when you've experienced a wave and it descends upon you and you've gone with the wave, we put our grief down and we pick up life. And it will be experienced in what we call 5 domains. It will affect you in these 5 realms. Now, we usually think of grief, obviously, affecting us emotionally. Now, whether we show it or not is a different story. Depends on your personality, perhaps your gender, your upbringing, the messages you've been given in childhood. But it could vary from anything from crying to profound sadness to yearning to anger, guilt, regret, jealousy, envy, maybe even relief in some cases. Your job is to be okay with those, because it's okay, it's normal. It's when we don't acknowledge these feelings and thoughts that they kind of get stuck in us. It also affects us physically, because grief is stress. That's why we started this night, this evening, by checking in with ourselves, slowing down our system, our autonomic nervous system, that could be making our heartbeat faster. If you experience eating or sleeping disruptions, nausea, backaches, very common in grief. It also affects us mentally. And that's frightening, because we like to keep things in order. We like to keep things in control. But when we're emotionally upset, when we're a little dysregulated, we don't have any bandwidth to remember things, to make decisions, to focus. It's temporary. It's not a permanent state. It also affects us socially. We could be highly sensitive. Certainly as the holidays are coming up, you may be dreading any invitations, if there are invitations during a pandemic, but in any case, I think it's going to be a little bit more relaxed this year than it was last year. But you may be dreading those. And it also affects us on a spiritual realm. Not necessarily religious, but certainly in terms of what's my purpose now? What's the meaning of life? Why did this happen to him or to her? He was such a good person. And so it brings in those kinds of questions. I played by the rules. Why did this happen? So grief encompasses all those realms, and it could be in the same day, it could be in the same hour. Your job is to face it and understand its normalcy, and to actually kind of pull it apart. Think about it, process it. Don't pack it away and put it away in a drawer or on a shelf. It won't get dealt with that way. So, what's good grief? Well, If you experience any of these things up on the slide, it's kind of like when you get a prescription and it tells you about all the possible side effects. This doesn't mean you have to experience it. Remember, because there's no stages. But if you see anything up there that looks and feels familiar, it's normal. Other than disbelief, numbness, and shock, you can experience just about anything on that list. So even if we were expecting a death and we were at our loved one's bedside when they died, we still go into a form of psychological shock and disbelief. And after that, you can experience anything up there. Any questions about that? Anything that maybe you've experienced and you'd be willing to share that isn't on the list? No? With a nod. Does this look familiar? Is the experience fairly familiar? At least some of those things up on the list? Yes, we have a question.
Yeah, a question. Like, the hard thing that I'm dealing with is when you lose your loved one and you were not able to be with them. And even prior to that because of situations. And so, months went by where that ended, my daughter that I'm talking about, my oldest daughter and everything. But not being able to be with her, trying to FaceTime her, and then, and then one of the nurses sent me.
That's okay, take your time.
That's the hard part I've never got over.
So for those of you who are watching us remotely, and those of you in the room who may not have heard this lady, she talked about the death of her daughter, and what's difficult for her right now is the fact that she wasn't able to be with her and see her, and I'm presuming it was due to the pandemic restrictions, because you talked about FaceTiming. Right, so really then maybe you're talking about a regret, not necessarily what you did or didn't do, but a regret because of circumstances, not being able to be with her. And that's something also that slowly and painfully we need to come to terms with. I know that's very difficult, especially as a parent. No matter how old our children are, they'll always be our children. We'll always want to protect them.
Well, actually, with this particular daughter, I spent about 45 years protecting her.
Okay.
She suffered mental illness.
Okay, all right. So this lady said that her daughter had suffered from mental illness, and she definitely had special needs that she attended to for most of her life. And so not being with her at the time of death is feeling like you didn't finish your job looking after her. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm glad you're here though. Any other comments or questions? So here was an example, right, of how the pandemic has made your grief experience even more complicated because of access, or maybe the limited number of people that were at your funeral ritual or at the church service. We had to do things differently. And that's another layer of grief that you have to get through as well, unfortunately, because of the time of year. Almost 2 years now. Thank you for sharing. So this is an example, right, of cognitive. I go to dial his number and then I remember he's not here. Or you go to the door because you thought you heard their car pull up in the driveway. Or you go to pick up the telephone, right? Or you think they're calling when you hear the phone ring. That's not your head not knowing. It affects you that way. It's really your heart thinking that they're still here. Because the heart is a reluctant learner. It takes much longer to learn what the head knew from the very beginning. Sheryl Sandberg, who lost her husband, said, "Grief is a demanding companion. In those early days and weeks and months, it was always there, not just below the surface, but on the surface, simmering, lingering, festering. Then, like a wave, it would rise up and pulse through me, as if it was going to tear my heart right out of my body. In those moments, I felt like I couldn't bear the pain for one more minute, much less one more hour." Sheryl Sandberg, husband died in 2015 of a cardiac event. She has 2 children. She's the COO of Facebook, or she was the CEO of Facebook at the time. So obviously grief pays no attention to bank accounts and to postal codes and to religions and to whether we're good people or not so good people. So this is a good book if anyone is interested who's lost a spouse. It's called Option B. So how are you going to get through this? Well, there is a difference between grieving and mourning. So grief is those 5 things. It affects us on those 5 realms. It happens no matter what if you were attached. Mourning, though, is an action you undertake to help you get through the grief. It is a decision that you make to process your grief, to unpack your grief, to peel off the layers. And how we do that is we express it outside of ourselves. We give it voice. We don't keep it in here locked up inside. So, I'm not talking necessarily about crying. I'm talking about whatever way you feel most comfortable expressing your grief outside of yourself. So mourning really is your grief turned into action. So, in the days gone by, when we lived in villages and someone died, we'd wear black. It was a sign of mourning. And when you walked through the village, people would know. And so they would come up to you and they'd ask you, who died? Tell me their story. Tell me about them. And that was a way to encourage mourning. And we have moved so far away from that in our society. Because we're really a mourning avoiding culture. Grief and loss are dreaded experiences that many wish to avoid or to rapidly solve. Right? We want to move away from it. You're given lots of invitations to move away from your grief. And because our brains are wonderful and want us to protect us from pain, you're going to come up with reasons why you shouldn't feel the way you should feel, or to come up with distractions. And so what we do is we engage in those behaviors set about by our society. The hurry up and move on messages. Well, it's been 6 months, I should be feeling better by now. Because somebody once told me that. So here are some mourning avoiding behaviors. Keep in mind that keeping busy also includes overworking or doing anything excessively. Gaming, being on the computer, surfing the net, anything that throws your life out of balance, and you're doing it to avoid the pain. And specific type of mourning behaviors, depending on the type of loss, could be rushing into a new relationship without having processed the death of your loved one, or in the case of a perinatal loss, rushing in and getting pregnant and having another baby too soon when you haven't mourned the child that died. And our culture supports it because we're very uncomfortable with witnessing somebody else's emotional pain. So if you can find somebody in your social circle that will patiently walk with you, won't push and pull you through this process, hold on to them. Use them. Because they're rare. Any questions about that? So these behaviors really are all about avoiding, numbing, distracting. So anything that we engage with, anything where we feel urgency to do it, or if you're brutally honest with yourself, anything that you do, when the pain is surfacing, when the wave is increasing and you avoid it, you're just going to have to deal with it later because it will keep trying to get your attention. So if I'm engaged with anybody who's early in the grief process, I'm providing them counseling supports. But if you come to me 3, 4, 5, 6 years later, then that's grief therapy. And there's a difference. Because you've probably engaged in mourning avoiding behaviors, and then we have to deal with that first before we can deal with the grief. Because usually these behaviors have created another issue. So grief isn't a problem that needs to be solved. It's a process that needs to be experienced. In a lot of ways you've earned it because you loved and you were loved. And when we engage in our mourning, when we authentically feel the pain and release it, the waves or our grief, it changes. It gets smaller. The waves get farther and farther apart. They don't pull us under. The current isn't as strong. We're able to put one foot in front of the other. We start to tell the story of our loved one's death without it being just on the surface. An authentic mourning leads to what we call integrated grief. And that's the kind of grief that I want for all of you here, where you move forward with your life. You learn to live on. You learn to move forward, but you take your loved one's memory with you. And that's integrated grief. That's not a grief that we're running away from anymore. That's a grief we've faced. That's a grief we've processed. We feel honored because we've had that experience of being loved. So I tried to hold it in, but I cried my eyes out. Tears of sadness have a different chemical makeup than tears of joy. They release stress chemicals. So that's where that old adage, you feel better after a good cry, that's where that comes from. It's like, whew, you've released stress. That's if you're a crier. You don't have to cry. What might be some ways, other than crying, that we can release our pain? What are some ways?
Screaming.
Screaming, yes. Getting it out, screaming, yeah. Hitting a pillow, yeah. What this lady did right here, she talked about it. She talked about it. She may have to talk about it again,
I talk a lot about
and that's fine. And you will continue talking about it until you don't need to talk about it anymore. Until the heart finally understands. So that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah, there was something on there about avoidance. I didn't see the whole.
Oh, okay. You want me to go back?
Yeah, just kind of, well, just explain that a little more to me about avoid. Does that mean you have to avoid things that make you cry?
Oh, no, 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 no. It's the opposite.
Okay, that's what I couldn't see.
Okay, no. Oh, okay. No, no. It's everything on the list
Okay.
and more.
And it is a trigger.
It's about, and I'm saying you need to go with that wave. Because when we engage in any of those behaviors, you're kind of at, if you engage in any of those behaviors, keeping busy, overeating, excessive spending, gambling, misusing or abusing of substances, avoiding the subject, not talking about your loved one, any kind of avoidance of triggers, the pain stays with you because you're avoiding the pain, and so it stays with you.
Could music be in that? Because music actually helps me. It reaches right to my soul, and I cry like I'm empty, and then I feel so much better.
Yeah. So the lady talked about music, and that is an excellent morning technique, using music. Yes. Now, I've also heard the opposite many times. I don't want to hear music because it triggers me. But are you going to go through life avoiding music? So avoidance only lasts for so long. I once had a client who had lost her husband. They were in their 40s and she had 3 teenagers at home. And so life, would get busy, although she tended to her grief as much as she could. There were times when she was honestly distracted because of just raising 3 children on our own. That's legitimate distraction, by the way, because we still have to pay the bills and feed the kids and go to work. When she felt that she hadn't done a morning and her grief was building up, she would do just what you mentioned, is that she would start playing all of her husband's favorite songs. And she'd call it dosing herself with Dave. And she'd sit in the middle of the living room and she'd cry, and she'd cry, and she'd cry, and she'd feel relieved after that. So do not be afraid of your pain. Don't be afraid of your pain. You've already made it through the worst day. That was the day they died. You've made it through the worst day. So the pain comes with having the privilege of loving them. Any questions? Comments? No? Do you want to take a break or should we continue? Should we take a stretch break? Yes? No? No? Who'd like to take a stretch break? You want hands up? No? You'd like to? Well, well, you could go ahead and take a walk outside if you'd like. Okay. I know. Get some air. You can come up here and take your mask off. So, let's talk about Christmas. Yeah? When the holidays hurt. Right? We have this image. Hallmark. Martha Stewart. Everything has to be perfect. Everyone has to be around the table. And as we've talked about, society's not good with pain. Well, I don't want to go to such and such a gathering because I don't feel holly and jolly. I don't feel the same way everybody else feels. Or you might get those hurry up and get well messages. What's the matter with you? Are you still grieving? And so we begin to feel very abnormal, right? We internalize that there's something wrong with us. But now you know, because you're here tonight and you're watching tonight, that what you're feeling is normal. You're not abnormal. And this is only for a space in time. If you do your mourning, you will not carry this with you the rest of your life in this intensity. And so what we do is, when we feel abnormal, we're going to submit to what everyone else expects. Like this lady, right? I was outnumbered. And maybe you're going to be outnumbered at holiday gatherings in the way you feel, but you have a right to feel what you're feeling. And if you happen to be with people who aren't compassionate and supportive, you're going to have to find a way, which we'll talk about later tonight, of looking after yourself. Because I'll tell you, if you attended a gathering and your leg was broken and you needed to rest, or you needed to go home and you couldn't make the whole evening, I'm sure you wouldn't think twice about that. You wouldn't attempt to dance on a broken leg just to please somebody else. So we don't want to engage in mourning avoiding behaviors as the season comes upon us, because it's stressful enough as it is. And this is one thing that you can control: how you're going to conduct yourself. So you've got a couple of choices. Well, 3. Are you going to ignore your sadness and put on that mask? Are you going to ignore the holidays? Are you going to figuratively pull the covers over your head? In one of the homes that my husband and I lived in, our neighbors across the street, they never put up any Christmas decorations, nothing. And we found out later that one of their children, and they were probably in their 60s, one of their children had died as a toddler. And so they never marked Christmas. Their other children had grown, they had grandchildren, but they never marked Christmas. And this was before I started doing bereavement work, and intuitively I just felt that didn't seem, it was so sad. It was so profoundly sad. I could certainly understand reluctance to do Christmas or the holidays at the beginning. But that resonated with me. So are you not going to acknowledge it? Is that what you're going to do? Because if you choose to avoid it this year, next year is going to be your first. It doesn't get better. Because then what you've done is you're waiting one more year, and the stress and the anxiety of how that Christmas is going to look like is going to be playing on you. So if this is your first holiday without your loved one, dip your toe in the water. Or you can choose to attend and participate in events while still physically and emotionally looking after yourself. You decide what you're able to tolerate. You decide you're going to write your own narrative. You're not going to follow somebody else's script. You can say no gently and politely and lovingly. I hope you understand, but I must leave now. So as I said, I will never ever say that pain is not part of this process. But whether you choose to suffer or not because of that pain is your choice. So, we'd all like grief to work in a nice straight line. Easy, simple, we know what's around the corner. But grief is in the driver's seat. It's got a hold of the steering wheel right now. So don't wrestle it out of its grip. Let it have its way, because this is what's supposed to happen. And very slowly, in time, you'll regain a sense of yourself, a new sense of yourself. So, you write your narrative, okay? Empower yourself. Don't submit to anything else that you are not comfortable with. If you're okay with it, fine. Don't do it for anybody else. So, acknowledge there's going to be pain this holiday season. That's a given. It's going to hurt. Figure out the things that are within your control. And don't expect a Hallmark experience. I once had a client who insisted on decorating the whole house after her husband died. She didn't want to do it. She was physically exhausted, mentally exhausted in her grief process. She did not have children, young children anyway, in the house. So I asked her why was she doing it, and she says, because of the people that are coming over. So she fell into the trap of wanting to please other people because of the expectations that our society holds. So remember, grief will ebb and flow, and when it subsides, that's when you let out the sigh, and that's when you get on with business until the next wave comes. It's going to peak at certain times, significant dates, holidays, family gatherings, vacation times, when cottages are open, whatever was significant in your family. Anticipation is always the worst. Our brains are wonderful, right? We can plan. We can anticipate, but we can also anticipate painful feelings and pain in the future. That's anxiety. That's a form of anxiety. What if I can't handle it? What if I break down? So the anticipation is always the worst. I'm providing support to a young mother who lost her husband to suicide. And we have a standing appointment every Wednesday morning. And yesterday was the first year anniversary. And so we talked about that, and she said, you know, it's exactly what you said. The days leading up to it were far worse than the day itself. She says, I don't know what I was expecting. And I reminded her, she's already gone through the worst day. Now, what happens though at anniversaries, it's a marker. It marks time, before and after. But we conjure up in our imaginations what might happen. And the day itself usually isn't as bad as we think it's going to be. And resist the temptation to cancel, because you'll just have to deal with it next year or the year after. Grief comes and goes, and I by no means have it figured out. It's a no-show when I'm expecting it, but it shows up in places and on days I never saw it coming. Sometimes it's brief, and other times it lingers for longer than I would like, but one thing I know is that there is no way to avoid it or pretend it isn't there. It's not the grief I want to avoid, it's the pain that comes with it. Trying to avoid the sadness and loneliness only prolongs the grieving process. So I lean into it and get through it. It's bigger than us at the beginning. So make it your companion, not your enemy. Viktor Frankl, who lost most of his family in a concentration camp, says, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Any questions, comments, anything you'd like me to repeat? No? Anyone want to take a break, stretch break? Yes. What's your name?
I thought it.
What's your name?
Madeline.
Madeline. Hi, Madeline.
And this is Jennifer, my daughter.
Jennifer's embarrassed.
Yeah.
No. Okay. Hi, Madeline.
Yeah. I often wondered, like, those of us that have lost loved ones in the last year, the year and a half, or whatever, this pandemic was like full blown, like, for a lot of us, when we lost our loved ones. It was right at the beginning of the lockdown, everything. And so that somehow would really change the dynamics of pain and sorrow, the mourning process, grieving, everything. And so I think those of us that have come through it and are surviving, we're up on the top of the tsunami or whatever it is, I think we owe a big kudos to ourselves, because it's been really difficult with all the restrictions and the vaccinations and not being able to be with your loved ones all at once, because not everybody was all double vaccinated, and so the family dinners weren't there, the get-togethers, so just to mention that the dynamics of
Absolutely,
family,
Madeline.
my friends, I couldn't socialize, my social life was gone.
Yep.
The women's choir that I sang with a beautiful choir, there was a lot of wonderful music.
Your social connections, yep.
There was
Yep.
nothing anymore to stimulate.
Yeah.
And that makes it harder even.
Yeah, so Madeline talked about that you should all give yourselves kudos for surviving the death and grieving and mourning during very extremely unusual circumstances. You were restricted. Like Madeline couldn't be with her loved one when she died. And then you were deprived of all the supports in the community from family and friends. So yes, these are definitely unique circumstances.
That's what I think. Those of us that are here tonight and that we're surviving, we're getting better, and that I think we really owe double kudos to all of us, because
Double kudos, she said. Double kudos to all of you. And the other thing also, Madeline, is, again, this is all coming from the heart, because our feelings come from the heart. They're not logical, okay? Nothing we experience is logical. There's a sense also, because of the restrictions that the pandemic has brought into our lives, there's a sense with a bereaved person that you didn't honor your loved one fully too, sometimes. That's some feedback I've received from clients. I didn't feel I did enough for him or her. The room should have been full. The church should have been full. The cemetery, the gravesite experience was different because we could only have a certain number of people. And again, logically we understand, but our hearts are not logical. And so that adds another layer as well. And so with somebody telling you, well, it wasn't your fault, isn't going to make that feeling disappear. Again, you have to process that. And you have to work through that. And your heart has to understand.
Christine, another thing I want to add to it, like in my case, like when my daughter was also alive, and found out that there was several illnesses that were compounding, and finally a cancer was involved in the last stages. And we got a call about, 2 o'clock in the morning, and the one doctor in particular, he was with the team, but he was the one that called and said, kind of laid it out pretty straightforward that she was not going to make it through the night. Did you want us to revive her? Do you want us to do this, do that? And it was just sort of, my husband and I, it was just sort of like the decision was, I don't know where it came from, but it came instantly. We said, let her go. So we did that too.
So that experience also, right, adds to regret or sadness and questioning, did I do the right thing? Yes.
So it was our choice. It was so funny, like, not funny, but it was kind of apropos, because throughout all the years, she died, she was 59 years old, just a couple of months shy of 60. She was diagnosed at 14, and it, I'm losing my train of thought here. It's just, the advocating for her all my life.
Right.
Advocating no matter where she was, bring her back home, we try and find placement, get her close to us, keep her included with the family, all that. And the last act, when I said that, the saving grace was that the doctor said, after we said, let her go on her own time, but keep her comfortable. And then he said, you did the right thing. He said, if it was my daughter, I could have done the same. So that kind of it was, I think if I hadn't heard that, it would have been even more.
Gave you some solace, Madeline. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that was my last act of advocacy. That's what I was
For her,
saying.
yeah.
For her. I didn't realize it at the time it broke my heart, and then I got thinking through it all the years how I've always been there for her. Dad and I
Right.
been there, help her, and Jennifer and the family, And I thought, that was, I'll look at it forever as a last act of advocacy.
Of love for her. Right.
We freed her.
Right.
Her free. Yeah.
Thank you. So here are some tips on how you're going to get through the holiday season. First of all, you've got to make up your mind. You've got to set the intention that you're going to get through this season however it looks, however it turns out. Be okay with imperfect, but you're going to get through it somehow. It's not going to look like the years past. It can't. It can't be normal. But you also can't ignore it, because that also isn't good mental health. Understand that your feelings are going to peak, and it's going to be a variety of feelings, and some feelings you may not have felt up until the holiday season. Anything that you feel, with the exception of doing harm to yourself or anyone else, is normal. Don't catastrophize. Don't think all or nothing. It's going to be horrible. I'll never get through it. You might be surprised. Understand that you're under stress. You're physically, emotionally, cognitively compromised. So prioritize what it is you want to do, what it is you're capable of doing, what it is you'd like to do. And don't overcommit. If someone asks you to do something and you're not sure, I'll think about it. I'll get back to you. I'll let you know. Be okay with that. Don't have any plans etched in stone. Okay? Have some flexibility going into this season. Talk about what you'd like. So give some thought individually, and then discuss it with family and friends. These are some of the things I'd like to do. What about you? And then find commonalities. I'll tell you a story about a client, a woman I had whose husband and son had died in a hockey team bus accident. So her husband was a coach, and her, I think, a 12-year-old son. So they both perished. And she had a surviving child, an older daughter. And she told me this after Christmas, unfortunately, that she desperately wanted to, that first Christmas, that first holiday season, was to have the Advent calendar, because her son loved that Advent calendar. But she thought if she put it out there, or if she even brought up the subject with her daughter, that it would trigger her. It would be painful for her. So she didn't do it. She kept it to herself. She didn't talk to her daughter about it. Only to find out after the holidays that the daughter did the same thing. She wanted the Advent calendar but didn't want to hurt mom. So if they'd only talked about it, they could have both cried and remembered brother and son. And if they did talk about it beforehand, and one wanted to and one didn't, then whoever wanted to could have it in their own room. So there are compromises so that you meet your needs without compromising anybody else's grief process. So to that, we all grieve differently, but there also could be similarities. So try to refrain from thinking that you're protecting your loved ones. So decide what traditions you want to change. Maybe just for this year you want to change some traditions. Maybe you want to eliminate them altogether. Maybe you say, just this year, we won't do such and such. Be okay with accepting help and asking for help. In our society, we're just so focused on individualism that we've got to do it ourselves. We don't want to appear weak. But if you ask for help, and that person in your life is willing to be there for you, they'll be honored that you've asked them. And be humble enough to accept offers of support as well. And when you get through this grieving process, you can turn around and offer your help to someone else in need. Don't be alone, but also find moments of solitude. So grief is an internal journey, right? It's a spiritual journey. So sometimes we need to be with ourselves. We need to be reflective, but I do not advise you to be alone. Like physically alone for the holiday itself. But as you know, you can be in a room full of people and also feel alone as well. And let go of those destructive myths. I should be doing this. We say in the grief business, we don't should on anyone, okay? So don't should on yourself. Don't keep saying, I should be doing this, I should be doing that. They should be doing this. You do what feels right to you. Think ahead. How are you going to answer people or respond to people when they say Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays? What's appropriate? Because it'll come, right? And it'll come from people who know that you're grieving and mourning. And be prepared for that. How are you going to respond to them? Become comfortable with no. If you want to give an explanation, that's fine. If you don't, no is a complete sentence if you put a period after it. No, thank you. Not this year. So again, what is it that you can control? Accept invitations. Ask the host, well, is it okay if I let you know the day of? Will that be okay with you? So not only be patient with yourself, but others as well. Again, attend to your spirit. That comes along with solitude. And if a religious belief is part of your normal, then you might want to focus on that this season. If your loved one was an adult and they had certain tasks, you're going to have to think about that. Who's going to give out the gifts? Who's going to carve the turkey? Who's going to play Santa? Who's going to make the turkey this year? What's going to work for everyone? And stealing this idea from Sheryl Sandberg's book is have an option B. Have an exit strategy. Have a plan B. If you're invited and you decide to accept invitations, take your own car. You might want to leave halfway through. You might want to say, thank you very much. I'm gonna leave now. That's okay. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. Shop on days that are not so grief-filled. Who's going to fill the empty chair? What makes sense in your family? What are you comfortable with? It's very important to include children. Obviously, don't give them carte blanche. You can give them options, you know. But they need to feel a sense that they're part of this as well. Anxiety is very closely related to fear, but it's not quite fear. So I guess I could say release your anxiety, because we will have anxiety. How will it look? How will I feel? And anytime you feel that, anytime you feel that you start to breathe rapidly, shallow, do your deep breathing. Slow everything down. Ground yourself. Take a moment to yourself. What's important this year? Maybe you want to pare it down. Always remember gratitude. While we tend to focus on what we don't have, I'd like you to start developing the muscle that recognizes what you do have still in your life. Not to take your pain away. It's not meant to say, well, at least you have other children, or you've got your family, or you've got grandkids. It's not about that. It's about balancing your sad with gratitude. You can't be happy and sad at the same time. You can be grateful and sad. And that's not disloyalty. Give yourself permission to laugh. Enjoy yourself. Especially if they're going to be children, part of the holiday season. They tend to ground us, don't they? They tend to bring us back to the present. Be okay with being in the present moment. It's not forgetting your loved one. It's not being disloyal. It's not about not honoring them. Because we do not have to be connected to them out of pain. I'm giving you permission to simplify this holiday season. You don't have to deck the halls, but you have to acknowledge the significance of what's coming up. Even if it means just a holiday wreath. Something. So Viktor Frankl says, in some ways suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds meaning. So here are some suggestions. These come mainly from my experience of working with the bereaved and what's worked for them. If prayer or religion is part of your normal, then you might want to start the holiday meal recognizing that somebody important is missing. Talk about it. Get it out of the way so that everybody is not anxious. Have a moment of silence, reflection. You might want to share a story. Yes, it might make you cry. But those are tears that need to be spent. Otherwise, they stay locked inside of you. You might want to do something like create a holiday album, online tribute. What are the meaningful traditions? In our family, the first year my mom died, we got a diagnosis of cancer in June, and she was given 6 months. She chose not to undergo any treatment, and she died within 11 days. But as soon as I heard that she had 6 months, my mind immediately went to Christmas. I held on to that. She didn't make it. But that Christmas, we decided we were going to attempt to make something quite simple, I understand, because I've told the story before and people have said it's easy to make, green bean casserole. But no one could make it like her, right? No one could make it quite like her, because it was passed on by her grandmother, my great-grandmother. And so because my father's a better cook than I am, he made it that year. And that's something we still continue. She died 16 years ago, but that's something we still continue. Who's making the green bean casserole? So that was a tradition we chose to continue. Maybe you want to start purchasing special ornaments or a tree. Maybe not this year, maybe in the future. And it could be in memory to your loved one. Some of my clients have lit a candle or had a favorite picture of their loved one on a sideboard during the meal. Hang their stocking and fill it with love letters. I fell into bereavement backwards. My first child was stillborn, and she would have been 25 years this year. And she was due this month, around this time. And I lost her in September. And so that first Christmas, that first holiday, was excruciatingly painful. But my mom still hung a stocking for Hannah. And what we decided to do that first year was that my husband and I bought a gift for a baby, and we donated it in her memory. It was very painful because I was supposed to be buying gifts for my child. But somehow that felt right. And we continued that tradition and bought a gift for a little girl every year, and we donated it in her memory. And it feels good, and we continue to do it. First few years it was very difficult. But now it's just part of our tradition. What are we going to get, what are we going to get for Hannah's gift? And when I had my daughter after Hannah, as soon as she was old enough, we'd go out shopping and we'd buy Hannah's gift together. And then we'd go down to the fire station and she would donate it. So what makes sense to you and your family to honor your loved one? Because it's going to be painful, but can you find something in your heart to say, I'm going to do this in memory of our loved one? Maybe you want to reach out to somebody you've lost contact with that's been on your mind. I remember making a wreath for her grave, and very difficult. Wasn't supposed to be doing that Christmas. And I would do a little at a time, and then I would leave it. And then I'd go back to it, because I couldn't tolerate it in one sitting. But as a parent, that was my way of continuing to try to parent her somehow. This might be a little bit more difficult under these circumstances, but you can certainly keep it in mind when everything opens up. You can still do it in their memory. I know somebody that's here that started a scholarship in honor of their loved one. And that way, their name is constantly being said out loud. They're never forgotten, right?
It's still going on.
It's still going on. Would you like to share about the scholarship?
Well, my husband was an electrician, and so my two daughters and I started a scholarship at St. Clair College, and it's for any young woman going into the electrical trade, and we give it each year. Because he had two daughters, and he also encouraged all the young women that went into the trade as apprentice. He was always very helpful to them, and mostly because he had daughters, and he encouraged them to do anything they wanted. So we felt that was appropriate.
Can you also share, Deanna, the gift that you made for each of them from one of his tools?
Oh, I took some of his, he had a lot of tools. So I took some of his old hammers, one for each of them and one for me. And I gave it to them, and I had it engraved on it that my dad helped me build my life.
So I'm just going to share this for
And I also keep a stocking every year and put a letter.
Oh, okay. So you did the stocking, the letter. Yep.
And I want to publicly thank you for everything you've done for me.
And now you're helping. And now you're helping someone else. Okay. And now you're helping someone else.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. How long ago was it? How long ago was it for you, Deanna?
4 years, and it's August.
August, yes, okay. So I just want to share with the people who are watching us remotely that Deanna's husband died very suddenly. He was an electrician, and so one of the things that she and her daughters decided to do was to start a scholarship in his name, intended for young females to get into the profession. Both his daughters are successful in fairly non-traditional female roles. So that was a way that the name will continue to be said. And Deanna says it continues, and this was 4 years ago. And so out of the pain, somebody else is benefiting in his memory, right? And that's how we can give meaning to our tragedies. Thank you.
Thank you.
So do something of meaning. Maybe they were involved in something. Maybe they enjoyed doing something. If it's in your wheelhouse, maybe you can pick it up and do it in their memory. Maybe you want to adopt a family. There's always people in need, right? So very similar to my story, buy a gift and donate it in their memory. Yes, Madeline?
Yeah, I would like to share a story about my daughter, named Jackie. I think she was on the track. She was in a group home about 5 minutes from her family home, so it worked out perfect, you know. And anyway, she had the mother-in-law apartment in this nice home on Askin, and 3 men lived in the front. And all the staff kind of like worked both sides back and forth, and, you know, really got to know Jackie. There were some superb people in her life. But every Christmas I would make like a big basket, and I would fill it with all kinds of goodies and stuff, and teas and hot chocolates and all stuff, and nuts, and so I'd make a big basket for Jackie, for her side and her staff, but then I would also make one for the 3 guys next door. So when you're talking about tradition, I'm thinking in the home, and then when I'm hearing other things, I think, well, that's my tradition is to...
And you could continue that.
Yeah,
exactly.
Staff keeps contact with it, they call, they
Yep.
send email, they stop in the meeting. And so I think
Yep.
like, it made an impact at that time, and sometimes it shouldn't it still be, that the guys will still be looking for their Christmas stuff.
And you can do it in memory now. And you can do it in memory of Jackie.
I thought of it, you know, it's all kind of like, this
Well,
is tradition.
There you, it was your tradition, exactly.
I was thinking of the whole church.
And it would become more meaningful now as well. So I told you the story about including a loved one's favorite dish. Maybe you want to create a special tradition, whatever's meaningful for your own family. Again, don't get caught up in the trappings, right? Keep it simple. If faith is part of your life, I hope you find solace in it. Be okay, be open to small joys, small slivers of hope this season. It doesn't have to be all bad. And maybe in that gratitude list, you list all the joys, all the gifts that they brought into your life that you would not have had if it had not been for that person. What do they bring to your life? What do they bring to the dance of your life? How do they change you? How do they make you a better person? How grateful are you for that? Make sure you set the intention, make the decision to create a space for hope, for the possibility of faith, of peace, of relief, for gratitude, and yes, even for a bit of joy. Make sure you keep that door open, even the tiniest bit. It does not have to be all or nothing. One feeling can sit right beside another feeling. You can create a space for hope. So set your intention, be okay with the pain, and balance it with gratitude. You might even find moments of joy. And allow yourself to also feel that. Give yourself permission. So here's some take-home messages. What you're experiencing is normal. It's natural, but what's necessary is the mourning. Absolutely necessary in order to get through this, so that you don't turn up on my doorstep wanting grief therapy or needing it. Everyone is going to be experiencing this very differently, even if you're grieving and mourning the same person. So appreciate the uniqueness of each person's grief experience. Again, set your intention, make up your mind. Yes, pain, but I'm going to get through this. Stay close to those people who will companion you, who won't push and pull you, who be witness to your pain. Okay? Find those people and stay close to them. If you don't feel it and you don't express it, it is not going to be healed. You will carry it with you the rest of your life. And it'll constantly try to get your attention if you don't pay attention to it now. So we know pain is part of the package. Adjust your expectations. Be very conscious when it comes to gratitude. It could be as simple on some of your worst grief days. It could be something as simple as I've got a roof over my head and a bed to sleep in. And yes, I hurt. And try to cultivate a belief, a mindset that you actually can cope. So I will end with this. Grieving is a journey that teaches us how to love in a new way now that our loved one is no longer with us. Consciously remembering those who have died is the key that opens the hearts, that allows us to love them in new ways. So in the grieving and mourning process, we learn to loosen our dependence on them physically and to create what we call a continuing bond. We love them in new and different ways, and that way they're always with us. So understand that these next few weeks are going to be difficult. Do what you can. Set your intention to heal. Write out your own narrative and self-care plan. Don't cancel, don't avoid, but just do what you're able to do. And I wish you a peaceful holiday season. The best to all of you. Thank you for coming out tonight, and thank you for joining us as well tonight.
Thank you so very much, Christine, for sharing your expertise with us and all of these most valuable ideas on how people can navigate this tough season. Thank you to each and every one of you also here this evening. We appreciate you all for coming, and we trust that you have gleaned some very valuable information this evening so that moving forward you'll be able to navigate this leg of your grief journey. So again, thank you all for coming. You're welcome to speak to Christine if you have any questions, like she said. And I, on behalf of Families First, also wish you all peace in this upcoming season. Thank you once again.